Like most of us, I've worked under dozens of bosses over the years. Some are micromanagers, some are completely hands-off, some are concerned with results, while others are more concerned with the remittance of timesheets and making sure no one leaves at 4:48 and cheats the company out of 12 minutes of work time. But I've never had a boss quite like Dr. Karen Cohen at the CPA. She has been masterful in my 3 years here at ensuring every employee has what they need to succeed while allowing us all to carve out our own roles that best suit our strengths. As Karen retires, we are taking this episode to look back on the astonishing career of the CEO of the Canadian Psychological Association. My name's Eric, I'm the communications person at the CPA, and this is Mindful. Over the past 15 years, Dr. Karen Cohen has led the Canadian Psychological Association and the profession of psychology in Canada into new areas of focus, a remarkable growth and increased presence at decision-making tables, and she has expanded the public's knowledge about what it is psychologists do. She's one of my 3 direct bosses at the CPA, or, as she puts it, as leader of a membership organization, one of 7,000 bosses. Now, it sounds like a line out of The Simpsons, because it actually was a line used in The Simpsons, but I do firmly believe that she believes every word of it. I'll talk to her about that and a lot more as we speak with Dr. Karen Cohen on the occasion of her retirement. How long have you been CEO of the CPA?
Right. Good question. I actually was hoping you were going to ask me a little bit how it is that I came to this work.
I know you got there through the registrar's office, I believe.
So I'm going to backtrack it just a tiny little bit, Eric, just because one of the questions I know I often get is like, how did you ever end up doing this kind of work as a psychologist? For sure, it was not, the career path we most think of, for sure. So my PhD was in clinical psychology. I did a postdoc in neuropsych and rehabilitation and really worked as a clinician for a good first third of my career. But during that time, you're right, I worked part-time as the accreditation registrar. In those days, I think it was a half a day a week, if you could imagine. Hardly enough now, given the number of accredited programs we have. And then around 2000, 2001, CPA took the decision to expand its human resource a little bit, and I became the associate executive director. So I did accreditation and then some sort of associate kinds of duties. And then after John Service left, would have been 2007, I applied and competed for the job as its ED. And then a couple of years after that, they changed my title to the CEO. So all to say, by the time I retire in March, it will have been 15 years as the CEO.
Is that a hotly contested job? Like when you applied for it, did you have to run attack ads against your opponents? How did that come about? Or do you just submit a resume? Or is it like when people apply for a tenured position at a university, a series of interviews and weeks-long intensive process?
Well, they did post and advertise the job. I was interviewed along with a number of other candidates. I'm not sure exactly how many other candidates there were. I don't actually recall how many interviews there were. It was with a series of board members. And and I ended up with it. How
steep is the learning curve? I'm wondering. When you first start, right, you're going from somebody who might advocate on their own behalf certain issues that are important to you to issues that are important to all psychologists across Canada and to Canadians in general, right? Mental health and that sort of thing. Is that a really steep curve, or is it just an expansion of what you were already doing?
Well, so here's the interesting thing. I mean, I know the CEOs of many different health professional associations and scientific societies, learned societies. And I really don't think there's a single profile for an excellent CEO. I think they come to it with overlapping, but also kind of unique skill sets. In some associations, the CEO is a member of the profession they're leading. In others, they're more of a career CEO that their expertise is managing not-for-profit associations. So I don't think there's a single profile. I think it depends on who gets hired, their skill set, And then you sort of staff around that, right? So, I don't think all the sort of characteristics that are, or skills that are important in a CEO necessarily are going to look the same from one to the other. Advocacy was certainly a big part of what I did. I was a practitioner before coming to the role. I understood the health landscape, the health system landscape, issues around mental disorders, mental problems, treatment services and intervention. And I kind of took on the practice advocacy. But we have a director of policy and public affairs. Glenn does a tremendous amount of advocacy as well. Lisa sort of leads up more of our science advocacy. So it is not typically, though, to your question, training in advocacy is not typically something that graduate schools give you.
Right.
And so it is something that you learn. Sometimes you learn on the job. You can certainly do training in leadership and advocacy. CPA has provided some to its members. We have our very important psychology researcher program, which is basically an advocacy group through which Glenn sort of reaches out to the folks interested in talking to government, and we give them lots of tools and resources on how to do so. So there's certainly a lot you can learn and know coming to this work, but it may not be things you're going to learn traditionally through graduate school.
Now that we have our advocacy toolkit and Glenn's helped to build that, and we're able to reach out to psychologists in that way, right? You mentioned that you understood the landscape when you first came into this role. I'm wondering now, how is that landscape different 15 years later than it was when you first took on the role in 2007?
I think what's really different now than 15 years ago is I think increasingly psychology has a seat at a lot of public and stakeholder tables that we didn't before. I think our input and opinion is routinely sought by government. Our leadership in health and well-being is really pretty well acknowledged by other health professions. I'm not saying it wasn't 15 years ago, but I think it happens more and more. I think if you were to add up the number of presentations we've made to standing committees of the House of Commons and the Senate, you would see an increase, certainly over the years. So I think we're a more familiar guest at the table, shall we say, where those matters are being discussed. I think the other really important thing is that mental health and increasingly the importance of psychological science to public policy has also changed. It's now largely being recognized. You hear people talking about mental health issues a lot, mental health needs, services and supports, how health systems either do or don't meet those needs. One of the messages we've been trying to give in more recent years, it's not just about mental health and illness, but how important human behavior is to public policy. So things like in a pandemic, people deciding to get vaccines and socially distance and wear masks, it's all about human behavior. So understanding behavioral science when you're creating that policy is important. Same for climate change. You want people to drive their cars less, compost, think about where they throw things out. Again, human behavior. So we've really been trying to promote that message. I think what's also changed over the past 15 years is that the landscape of regulated health professions. And that's a good thing. The more accountable healthcare practitioners there are to address people's mental health needs, that enhances access, and that's a good thing. But mental health, although there's lots more recognition about how important it is, I've often said it's something that's understood broadly but not deeply. So sometimes public conversations, even among learned stakeholders, treat mental health as if it's all the same thing. Right? We had a mental health commission. We would never have a physical health commission. It would be ridiculous. But yet somehow we can talk about mental health as if it's all the same, which in fact it's not. The needs of a person with postpartum depression or anxiety or PTSD are different. And similarly, we talk about all the disorders as the same, as if all the interventions or services and supports are the same too. Also not true. Certain approaches and certain things work better with certain kinds of problems. So we have a little ways to go there. I think the other change, I'm going to go further back than 15 years of being CEO, but in the course of my career, is that when I graduated, many of my graduate student colleagues went on to work in the public sector. They worked in hospitals and schools and correctional facilities. And I think increasingly now psychologists are going to work in private practice. They have more control over their workload. They can do the work that they want. There's people needing their services, all good things. The downside to becoming a more private practice oriented profession, of course, is that is access to Canadians, because those services are not as well covered as when the psychologist who's salaried in a public institution, there's no charge for that service, whereas there is in private practice. But the other thing is that we're not at the decision tables. So if we're not in the public sector, we're also not at the public sector tables where policy and program is being discussed. And so we have less opportunity to shape those discussions. On the research and education side, there are issues we were championing 15 years ago. I wish I could tell you we weren't still championing. We are. So one of the things way back when the Canadian Institute of Health Research took over from Medical Research Canada, the hope and the mandate was that they were going to acknowledge the biopsychosocial nature and importance of health research. And I think it still tends to be, at least according to some, more biomedically focused rather than including the psychosocial dimensions to health. And I think that's really an important thing, because I was trained as a health and rehab psychologist, and you could pick almost any chronic illness, and it's really about behavior. How well you live with a chronic illness is about behavior. Do you take your medications? Do you have the supports? Are you managing your mood? Is the environment accommodating your mobility or needs? All of those things. So I can't underscore enough how important that is. And I think another thing that's changed is we're hearing more about it now, the increasing use of contract rather than tenure track professors. I know our Scientific Affairs Committee is developing a paper on that very topic. Contracts, you certainly don't create the kind of space and incentive for people with doctorates to go into academia. The last thing I'll say in terms of changes is also what's happened over the past, might even be longer than 15 years, is the end of mandatory retirement. And so that's changed what the profession looks like, and what, who's in positions when they leave positions, who takes on new positions, makes planning harder. No, I'm not advocating for mandatory retirement at all, but I'm saying that when retirements were known, planning around that is different in terms of needs and supply and demand when it wasn't.
Now we're talking about your retirement.
Yes.
And I wanted to call in guest experts to tell me about work-life balance.
Oh, you're hilarious. That's true. Okay, girls, let us know.
Madison, you were first on the call, and I just want to know, from your perspective, over the last 15 years, you were probably very, very young when your mom became the CEO of the CPA. What did you think that meant?
I don't know if I consciously had a definition of what her job or what being a CEO meant when she started to be the CEO, if that makes sense. But I did soon come to realize, as I got a bit older and she started to talk to me a bit more about her work, that it's a lot of juggling. And we like to kind of joke around in the family that mom has always been the fixer. And I think she also does that both at work and at home. So if you got a problem, mom's the person to talk to. But I think it was definitely inspiring growing up, especially as a young woman trying to figure out what I wanted to do. And her and my father are both the inspiration for why I went to graduate school. But to see her as a CEO, being incredibly successful, gave me a lot of motivation.
Is it intimidating? I mean, I'm intimidated when I walk into Karen's office, because I feel like, I'm speaking to somebody with a vast wealth of expertise beyond my own. Is it intimidating to have to live up to that standard, Sydney? As you go through life, do you have to, are you a little bit worried that your mom casts a long shadow?
I think similar talk track, and I love how she's taking a water break for this one, but she instilled that. Exactly to your point, intimidating, but now there's no other option. She is the standard in our eyes of what success looks like all around. And I think our dad did a really good job of making sure we knew that as well. He was her biggest cheerleader and the first person to let us know that she's the smartest person in the room.
I feel that all the time, that Karen is the smartest person in the room, and we all defer to her.
Maybe if I'm in the room by myself. Okay, I'll give you that.
Technically, you are in the room by yourself right now.
That's true. That's true. But I imagine that, as family members, you feel a little more licensed to push back. What did that look like when you were kids?
Oh, I'm going to let you take this one, Sid.
I was going to say, me and Maddie have polar opposite approaches. I think I got the feistiness, and Maddie's more calculated. So what do you always say, Mom? We're like different pieces of you and Dad, just in two very opposite human beings.
Unfortunately, and I feel terrible, I never was able to meet your dad. And unfortunately, he died just after I got to the CPA and before COVID began. And, what's that been like? I mean, for Karen, I know that was so hard for you, and it obviously had to be hard for Madison and Sydney as well. A terrible time over the last couple of years, but how have you guys coped with that?
We're still coping, I would say. Huge kudos to you, Mom. Doing your job every single day, remembering all the words of advice he gave us. So I think the answer to that is ongoing, work in progress.
I think if anything, though, just to add, it kind of brought us three closer together. And that might be a factor of all of the things that have happened in the past 2 years. I don't know. Has COVID been going on for 2 years? Is it 3 years now? I don't know.
Almost.
Anyway,
Yeah.
So I think like this entire series of events, I think, has brought the three of us a lot closer in terms of just like day-to-day life interactions, which I love.
And I would just add, I'd agree with both what Madison and Sydney had to say. Keith really was, I don't want to get emotional here, but he really was my biggest cheerleader. He was really the quintessential partner, I have to say. I feel blessed we had the years that we did. And, it's hard to face retirement without him, frankly, because I sort of feel like we missed the dessert off the meal course, right? The time when we were to go off and sort of enjoy the fruits of our labors. But it's a journey. I now understand grief a lot better than I ever did before. I think it's something you carry with you rather than something you get over. And the way that I think about it very visually is I sort of picture this old cart in a field, and with time, the old cart, a flower blooms, the birds perch on it. So the grief is still there, but positive things stand beside it. And my two big positive things, frankly, are Madison and Sydney and how our relationship has evolved.
Sydney, when you were growing up, how did you understand psychology? I remember, my dad would tell me what he did for a living, and I misunderstood 100% of what he was explaining. He worked at Stats Canada in the agriculture division, and I thought he physically went out to a field and counted sheep and then wrote down the number and then sent that into the government, and that was his job. Like, what did you think your mom's job was when you were a kid?
That's a good question. Obviously, psychology is not the easiest kind of field to grasp when you're little, but I do remember when she took over for CEO, I just thought that was so cool. She was this big boss. I used to call you what, Mom? The big poncho. I actually thought it was called poncho, not honcho. And it's kind of been a running joke till today. But going back to that first answer, it's kind of why Madison and I have such a high standard for ourselves and where we're going to take our careers. And I would unequivocally attribute that to my mom.
That's great. I'm going to make that the title of this episode when we publish it. The poncho says goodbye,
Bye.
Well, the kids used to say to me, but Mom, you're the boss. And I'd go, I have 7,000 bosses. There's this perception that when you're the CEO, obviously you're the boss. And that's not really true. We are a member service organization. And, early on, when I was deciding whether to go this route to be the CEO, I talked to a mentor of mine and he said, it's important work and advocacy is very important, but do you want to be a handmaiden to the profession is what he said to me. Because I have there been times when I felt like a handmaiden? Maybe. But it has been a life of service. It really is. CPA and a not-for-profit organization can't just reflect the views of its leaders. It has to reflect the views and needs of its membership.
That was spoken like a true politician. I have 38 million boxes. But is that the next step? Is that where you're going in retirement? Are you going to get into municipal
Am I going to get into politics?
For mayor?
I have a few sort of ideas in the queue, none fully formed yet, so I won't give you the inventory list, but more than one or two people have suggested that public life might be the life for me, but I'm not sure yet.
Still to be determined. Eh?
Still to be determined. TBD.
One of the reasons I wanted Sydney and Madison here was because, in addition to representing 7,000 psychologists across Canada, right, you're also the boss of us here at the office, and you've for a long time, especially since COVID started, been talking to us about work-life balance and making sure that it's proper for all of us and that we're all doing well with that. And so I wanted to talk about your work-life balance. You delayed this meeting by half an hour today, and I believe it's because Madison was late dropping off her cat. Am I right?
You're absolutely right. It was because I wanted to say goodbye to Madison before she headed off to Australia, and I wanted to eat lunch. So I needed that half an hour for those two things.
Has that always been a thing? Have you always been able to maintain that balance well over the course of 15 years as a CEO?
Well, yeah, that's a really interesting question. When Keith was alive, we used to joke that on my headstone, it should say just one more thing. I'm the person who thinks there's always time for just one more thing. I don't know. I think as a parent, no matter what jobs or roles you do, you always wonder if you did enough or you did enough of the right things. So I'd be lying if I told you that, there haven't been moments when I thought, oh my goodness, I'm working too much or I wasn't there enough. I tried my best. I think certainly our girls had a real presence of both their parents in the home. But yeah, there have been times over 15 years when I probably worked more than I should have. That's probably true.
A few too many aftercare programs.
Yes, you guys have been. You guys have been to every day summer camp known to Ottawa and the surrounds, I think.
I think
you play a game about that.
You sent me to a clown camp once that lasted.
Yeah.
Before lunch, I was like, come pick me up right now.
Wait, you went to a clown camp and didn't enjoy it?
I know. I guess I'm the yes, yeah, that's on me then.
What does that entail, or were you not there long enough to find like balloon animals and
lunch? I didn't even make it to lunch, Eric. I don't
know. Madison, what's the worst camp you went to?
Okay, well, this one isn't that bad, but it wasn't the best experience. I did a robotics camp once, and it was quite fun, but I was the only girl, and that was really hard. So Mom let me come home on the days we went swimming because I didn't feel super comfortable. So like the camp and what it was really interesting, but Mom definitely let me like move the schedule around so that, I was comfy, which I think is important. So not quite as dramatic as the clown camp, though.
I will confess, though, one of my worst balance moments wasn't when I was working for CPA. It was actually while I was working for the hospital. I think it was before you were even born, Maddie. So Maddie would have been little, and I would take her to daycare, and then I'd go off to the hospital to work. Well, I forgot to go to the daycare. And I was pretty close to work when I realized Maddie was asleep in the car seat. So I hadn't left her in the car or anything like that. But I'd forgotten, I didn't take the exit to take her to the daycare, and she almost ended up doing a shift with me at the hospital. So that was a work-life balance moment, I guess.
Sydney, what is it you're doing now? And then Madison, really quickly, what are you doing now as well?
I went the complete opposite direction of both my parents. I'm in cybersecurity sales, but definitely have my mom's mindset for sure.
Nice. And Maddie?
I just finished my PhD in biomedical engineering, and I'm currently a software engineering consultant for a wearable tech company. You were saying that one of the things that people would say about you is that it was always one more thing, like Columbo, right? Just one more thing. And Lisa sent me a note and said that if she were going to pick one thing that immediately came to mind about you, it's I have an idea. Right? And so you're always walking into her office with a great idea, and it leads to something terrific. What have been some of the best ideas that you've had over the 15 years? Like, what are the highlights of the career?
If I look back and try to think about, what are the things that I've been proud of, I really think we have a much bigger advocacy footprint than we did before. I think back in the day, we might have had a advocacy meeting once or twice a year on the Hill, but We've made many, many more opportunities. And I think we've actually had a hand in actually shaping Canadian legislation. I'm not sure a lot of psychologists realize that. So I'll give you some examples. So really the proudest advocacy moment for me, and I've said this to some folks, but never in an article necessarily or a grand scope, is that when Canada was debating same-sex marriage, of course, they struck a committee, a House of Commons committee. And I was in Vancouver at the time at some psychology meeting or another, and the deputy CEO called me back and said, we have to present before committee, because released into the media was this feeling advanced by some that somehow if you had parents of the same gender, it would do damage to the development of children.
Right.
And we were able very quickly, that's our wheelhouse, to look at the literature that looks at identity and development in kids, and quickly conclude that that was not in fact the case, that if the children of same-sex parents had any challenge at all, it was how society embraced them rather than the actual orientation of their parents. And so I was able to go to this House of Commons committee and advance that view of the literature. And when I was done, two of the MPs stood up and clapped. And that probably was one of my proudest moments. There were people on that committee advancing completely opposite view, but I was very proud of that. And I think that for me embodied the best of what we can do as researchers and practitioners, is lend what we know to make good public policy. So that was no doubt a highlight. But we've changed legislation in additional ways. Another example is medical assistance in dying. When that legislation was being proposed, as is usually the case when you get invitations from House of Commons committees, sometimes you just have hours to present. They might say, and we need you in 48 hours to present at such and such a time, and you've got to bring a brief together. So we did submit a brief, and that had a series of recommendations, but one of them was, one of the things when they were developing that legislation, of course, if they were going to make it legal to participate in an end-of-life decision for a patient, there needed to be exemptions from the criminal code, because otherwise it's murder or counseling to commit murder. And so while they got the piece that, of course, the physicians and nurses who participate in end-of-life decisions need an exemption, what we were able to say is that you need to exempt folks like psychologists as well, because they may talk to patients about their concerns and ideas about end-of-life decisions, and the criminal code finds it illegal to aid and abet a suicide. So because of that presentation, we are actually named in the MAID legislation, psychologists being exempt from the criminal code if they engage in those kinds of conversations with people trying to decide what their end-of-life days will look like. And then a third example is I sat for a few years in the early 2000s and then just finished another term now on the Disability Advisory Committee to the Minister of Revenue. And we did a lot of work on how you assess eligibility for people with disabilities related to mental disorders. And as a result of the series of recommendations we made, those changes to eligibility are enshrined in legislation. So those are things I'm really, really proud of on the big right. scale. You mentioned the pro bono, absolutely. I'm also really proud, Eric, of Synopsis. I just love Synopsis. It was a member-facing publication. Committee chairs would report, and that's important information for members to know what each others are doing. But what we've done with Synopsis, and I think actually way back when it was a suggestion of a past president, that we theme them and we get guest editors. And the way we theme them, though, is, and I guess that was the part that, that was my contribution in terms of idea, is that it be themed around the things that's keeping society up at night. So whether it's climate change or health system change or psychology in schools or human rights and social justice, it's an opportunity for psychologists to write in a very accessible way, not just for each other, but for the public, for government, for funders, for decision makers. What does the science and practice of psychology have to say about these really important societal issues? So I'm really proud of that too. And I'm going to add, I'm also really proud of CPA staff. I really, really am. We have a really outstanding team of skilled and accomplished people, and CPA owes its success to our team together. Despite the challenges of the last few years on everyone, our membership grows each year. It's the highest in our history. And I think that's because of the great team we have working for CPA.
It's definitely a great team. And I agree with you on synopsis. I love synopsis. I love reading synopsis. I'm not even a psychologist, and I find it very informative and interesting. I'm wondering, though, how difficult it is to get psychologists to write in an accessible way for them. Is that something that you've had to, go back and forth with people on and say, you can't use so many acronyms?
We do. I think, that's a really, really important thing. And that really interfaces too with the advocacy discussion, because as psychologists, we know how to talk to each other and we know how to talk to other health providers and other scientists, but we don't really learn in graduate school how to talk to the public.
Right.
Or how to talk to government, how to talk to funders. So it really is a learned skill. Not everyone has it. And so editing a synopsis, it requires a great deal of tact. We do have a managing editor, in fact, and this topic sometimes comes up in interviews. How do you respectfully shape an article? And sometimes we get submissions, they look like they're journal submissions. In fact, I think sometimes they might have been at one point journal submissions in the way they're formatted. And so it is a real process of diplomacy to try and help them revise it in a way that it meets the synopsis purpose, which is a very accessible, plain language, 400 to 900 words rendition of the work. Yeah.
How long has synopsis been going now? Was it there before you got there and you shaped it the way it is today?
Yeah, I think it was called Psychology Highlights before it became synopsis. And if memory serves, I think it was a member, there was a member little competition to pick a new name for it. But I think that the shaping of it into a more public-facing document would have been in the last 5 to 10 years, probably 10 years, actually. And this year we decided to carve off a digital publication that I think you're going to participate in bringing together, Eric.
Yes.
And that's going to be the member-facing piece. So, what's happening in my department, or, maybe some individual spotlights on careers or that kind of thing, proceedings from meetings. And we'll have that as a separate digital publication so that, members still get to keep on top of what each other are doing.
Terrific. And I'm looking forward to participating in that when it begins. Those are some of the highlights. I would also add conversion therapy, the recent ban on conversion therapy, that the CPA was a big part of advocating for that, and got that done. I think that's a big highlight too.
True.
Now, any regrets? Anything that you really wanted to get done in your time as CEO that you just weren't able to do?
Yeah. Advocacy is fast and slow. And what I mean by that is sometimes things can turn very quickly on a dime because of who's in a decision maker role. And sometimes you could be plodding away on the same message, which I think to some extent we have for science and practice. For practice, it's been access to psychological services, funding for psychological services. That's been a very consistent message over 15 years. And for science, it's been the funding for science. Those have been certainly two venerable messages. And I might have hoped, I think we're on the brink of achieving parity between health coverage for mental and physical problems right now, but we're not there yet. So that might be one. And I think while societies and Canadians understand how important mental health is to a much greater extent they did 15 years ago, we still don't have parity. We still don't really recognize either in science funding or in health practice the importance of the psychosocial aspects of health. I think I might have hoped would be further along. I'm concerned about new graduates looking for academic careers, having challenges wrestling with contract positions, which don't give them the incentives and supports they need. And in private practice, having become perhaps more of a private practice profession in many ways, it concerns me what impact that has on accessibility and the opportunity to contribute to public policy. So, yeah, advocacy is fast and slow. I'll leave it at that.
For sure. And, as you said, psychologists don't really have training in advocacy. Now, I want to do something here where I got a few people to say a few things. So I want you to be able to respond to a few of those. So
okay.
Ian Nicholson told
Yes.
me that, he had the good fortune to work with you when you were part-time as the registrar for the accreditation panel. But what struck him over the many years is your ongoing and deep concern for how training affects the future of the profession, right? Wanting to ensure that the future is as strong as possible. And so I'm wondering if you could just tell me a little bit about that, right? The training that psychologists receive and how that affects the future of the profession.
Yeah, I really think we have a responsibility, whether we're educators or researchers or practitioners, to address the problems people in society face. And so I think there are some real sentinel areas right now that society needs our help on. The needs of an aging population, for example, the impacts and determinants of climate change, how to cope with the pandemic. There are health psychology. These are all things that I think in our training we need to learn something about. Now, it's graduate school would take 20 years if we, graduated being experts in all of these areas. But I do think programs have a responsibility to look to their patient populations, to look to the needs that patients bring to them, and try to align those with what we train psychologists to do. Now, obviously, every psychologist needs to exercise their own choice. I want to work with this kind of person or this kind of population, of course. But I think we also have a responsibility to be responsive. And sometimes we need to remind ourselves about that.
For sure. Now, you mentioned, editing synopsis requires a certain level of diplomacy when you're discussing the way that something is going to be presented. I imagine that when you're speaking to political committees and that sort of thing, that requires a good deal of diplomacy as well. Wolfgang Linden, he told me that he really appreciated your juggling skills, right? The ability to provide strong leadership while also trusting others enough to delegate without needing to micromanage, right? Keeping current programs running while on the lookout for promising new initiatives. But the main thing that he said, you were able to do all of that while behaving like a diplomat. And I'm wondering if you can describe to me what behaving like a diplomat means and how important diplomacy is in the position that you have.
I think it's, having, first and foremost, I think, conducting yourself with respect and with kindness to hear what people have to say is critical. It's critical to any job. I think it's really critical to this job. And being able to, obviously there's frustrating and challenging times when what's going on inside your head may not be the things you want to be heard outside of your head. So nobody's superhuman. But I think for me, what's been exceptionally important in dealing with people, and maybe that's what's perceived as diplomatic, I'm not sure, is I work very hard to try to see a problem from all sides. And so even if I'm working with someone I disagree with, I just work very hard to hear what they're saying and to see it the way they're seeing it, because I really do believe that when you can account for all those perspectives, we'll end up in a better place when trying to solve that particular problem. I really believe that.
I think that's excellent advice for all of us, to be able to look at every side of a problem. Okay, this is the last one, and I want to close on this one. Heather McIntosh, you've been a leader in the field, a mentor to many, an inspirational advocate for mental health in Canada. And she says she's learned so much from you about what it means to be a psychologist, a scientist, a practitioner, a supervisor, all of those things. The field's going to miss your daily contributions, but there are many of us who carry your wisdom in and around the profession. And there are many of your offspring that are going to carry the torch from here. And I'm wondering what you want those offspring to be carrying the torch about. What do you want to see happen in the field of psychology in the next several years?
So I just love that, because I have always felt that I've carried my mentors on my shoulder. And to the extent that Heather or anyone else feels that I'm going to sit on someone else's shoulder, that to me is just a really supreme compliment. I think we all stand on the shoulders of the people who came before us. I'm really grateful to my mentors and glad to have had an opportunity to mentor other people. I think if I had to just sum it up, I would say that I think the study and practice of psychology is so relevant about what matters to people and communities and organizations and societies. And there really is no piece of public policy, there's no piece of program to which what we know about how people think, feel, and behave isn't relevant. So if I had to say to anyone, one final advice, it would be don't lose sight of why your work matters and to whom it matters. It's exceedingly important, I think. We don't have to think very hard and long to see what the applications are of our work, even if we're not practitioners. Scientists, the application of science is incredibly important. And the problems and the issues that plagued us in the past few years, be it the pandemic or climate change, human rights, racism, discrimination, truth and reconciliation, wars and conflicts, they are all about people and how people behave. So societies need us. They really depend on what we know, on what people think. And we have a responsibility to our clients, to our students, to our colleagues on an individual level. But I really believe we have a responsibility to societies. I hope that we keep that in mind.
I hope so too. And I hope that we can help to repair some of the things that are wrong in our societies today. And that's kind of the thing too, right? I mean, this might be the moment where I have never felt so pessimistic about society in general in my entire life, right? Like all the things that you're mentioning, right? A major war breaking out in Europe, I would never have imagined seeing that in my lifetime. A pandemic that's caused so much chaos around the globe, right? This rise in extremism and racism that we see and all this. Are we better off now than we were 50 years ago, 20 years ago, 10 years ago?
Are we better off? Well, I'm probably not the expert to answer that question. Yeah. I think that there's more awareness, more is being said, and I'd like to hope that maybe to make change, you first have to acknowledge the problem. And we're hearing a lot about the problems, and we're sort of laying bare all the things we've done and haven't done or should have done. And I'm going to choose to be hopeful that awareness is going to lead to change, to positive change.
I think we can all choose hope.
I guess I've met a lot of leaders within government. That's really been an honor and special to me. I met a lot of ministers. An interesting story, when I was a kid, I came to visit Ottawa. I must have been 10. And we went to Parliament Hill, and we actually met the Prime Minister, who at the time was Pierre Trudeau. And I met him in the House of Commons, and he looked me straight in the eye, and he asked me how long it took to get to Ottawa from Montreal. And I thought to myself, he's the Prime Minister of Canada. I think he must know how long it takes to get to Montreal. He's trying to make conversation. That's what he must be trying to do. And I gave him the answer. But fast forward many decades later, almost in the exact same spot, I was doing a lobby with CPA on Parliament Hill, and I met his son when he was Prime Minister in almost the exact same spot. And we had a very brief, he said hello. And I thought that was very meaningful to me, and very interesting that it had happened in the very same spot. Father and son, many, many decades apart. Meeting Andre Picard, Mary Walsh, Governor General David Johnston during an Meow event. These have been I've met many senators. These have been really meaningful moments to me to talk to folks who've really, in their own ways shaped our country. Right. Has really been an honor and a privilege. On a fun note, though, we used to have a foundation. CPA had a foundation. And back when I was the associate executive director, I was the executive director of the foundation. And we would have silent auctions at every convention, which were a tremendous amount of work to organize, but so much fun. So many members really missed the passing of the foundation in those auctions, because we'd have these lively bidding wars over things that most of us wouldn't even buy, but we were doing it because it went to a good cause. And there was a member or two who used to take great pleasure in outbidding me for one thing or another. But those were really that was really a fun time for sure. Those are just a few. I guess nothing too cataclysmic, but the ones that came to mind.
I was realizing a little while ago, I've met a lot of prime ministers and governor generals, but never while they were a sitting prime minister or governor general.
Right.
My first experience with that, I was 10 years old. Also, I was in an airport. My dad said to the guy next to him, "Oh, hey, you're just flying regular with the rest of us." And we're sitting in the lot. It was John Turner, who had been the prime minister, I guess. And knew nothing of this. I'm, such a little kid, like, okay, well, this guy with white hair is somebody important, I guess. There's a lot of people who want to talk to him, but he was sitting right next to us in the lobby of the airport, ready to go. And then same airport, many years later, my cousin calls me and says, hey, can I stay over at your place? I'm going to be in Ottawa. I'm flying in from Nunavut and I need to, I have a long layover. Can I stay? Sure. I'll come to the airport and pick you up. So I'm ready to pick him up. And before we go, I just have to say goodbye to the people I'm traveling with. So we go into a little room that I didn't even know exists, this private secret room in the airport. And there's Mikhail Jean and her husband, John Ralston Saul. Just
Wow.
That's who he's traveling with. That's what this delegation is. And so I spent some time in there talking to them. And the first thing I did was I found the only empty chair in the room to sit down, and everyone in the room panicked. No. Apparently it's a decorative, historic chair of some kind.
Oh dear.
It isn't actually for sitting, and it's an heirloom, and I could have broken it. So yeah.
Oh, that's funny. Yeah, it's a small country, right? And so these things happen, right? Because it is such a small country. But it's been a great privilege, I have to say. It's been a great privilege.
Well, it's been great getting to know you these past few years, even if it's mostly been via Zoom.
It's true. Yeah. Eric, you're a treasure to CPA. You're a great asset. I really have a lot of respect for you and your work. I'm grateful. We signed on the dotted line to have you come join.
I appreciate that. And
Me too.
Jen is also appreciative. She's happy about it.
Oh,
and
good.
I love what I'm doing. I think it's, I feel like I'm contributing to somehow make a difference. So
I'm glad. I really, I'm drawing this out, but I'm going to just say this one more thing. It's really important that everybody feels they have initiative and they have autonomy and they have a bus to drive. I think that's always been important to me. It's hard as CEO because the more you delegate, the less intimate detail you have about how things work. When you do it all yourself, you know how it works. And in early days, you do it yourself. But as you mature, you realize you need a really good team, and to have a really good team, that team needs to feel like they are trusted and they have autonomy and they have a bus to drive.
It is a testament to Karen's leadership, I feel, that every one of us at the CPA is now driving our own bus. The best leaders make everyone around them better, and Karen is no exception. In all my time working under CEOs and executive directors and program directors and station managers and so on, I've never worked with anyone who lives this philosophy the way Karen does. And now that she's moving on, the bus will continue rolling without her. We'll continue moving along under a new CEO, and there will be very few hiccups along the way. We'll miss Karen dearly, but she set us all up for success in her absence, no small feat, with the gargantuan amount of work that gets done in our office every day. I want to thank Karen not only for taking the time to reflect upon her career with me today, but for being approachable, compassionate, understanding, and endlessly capable as the leader of this organization. I'd also like to thank you for listening, streaming, and downloading this episode, leaving a review, sharing it with others, whatever it is you do. Mindful is written, hosted, published, and scheduled by me, Eric Bowman. Jamie Montgomery is our editor and producer, and our theme song is Avenues by David Taylor.